Hello everyone, I'm Loanne Lake, Communications Director for Leading on Opportunity. Welcome to Shaping Opportunity, Conversations with the Leading on Opportunity Council. We've created this interview series for you to hear from our council members about their work to address the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, we will look at how our cross-cutting factors, the impact of segregation and social capital, affect economic mobility here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Today's interview features Council Member Laura Clark, President and CEO of United Way of Central Carolinas. She will be interviewed by fellow Council Member Federico Rios about the types of initiatives being funded through the COVID-19 Relief Fund. Let's tune in.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Federico Rios. I am the Assistant Director for the Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration with the City of Charlotte, and I am a proud member of the Leading on Opportunity Council. I'm joined today by Laura Clark.
Hi, Federico.
Hi, Laura. Could you give us a brief introduction on the work that you do?
Sure. I'm Laura Clark. I'm the President and CEO of United Way of Central Carolinas and also a member of the Leading on Opportunity Council.
Well, Laura, beyond the fact that you and I are both on the council, we also are both a part of the COVID-19 response, emergency response grant that has been put forth by your organization, the United Way, and the Foundation for the Carolinas. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how that's been keeping you busy, addressing the needs of residents during this pandemic, and if you can talk to us about the grant as a whole.
Sure. So the COVID-19 Response Fund was started by the Foundation and United Way very early in the pandemic crisis here in Mecklenburg County. In fact, when we look at other communities and the funds they started, I think our community was probably one of the first relative to where we were in the pandemic to recognize that we were going to have a significant need related to the crisis and needed to be able to respond to it. So we launched the fund with the intention of using it flexibly throughout the crisis to meet needs as they evolved. One thing both the foundation and we were clear on was that we didn't know where this was headed, and we didn't know how long it was going to last and what needs might emerge, and so didn't want to set really hard and fast parameters around what we might fund. So to date, it has been open to any 501c3 that can demonstrate they have a need, but primarily the fund has been focused on meeting the most basic needs in the community. So the vast majority of dollars, which now is about $10.5 million that's been granted, include food, shelter, housing, emergency financial assistance, health, mental health. You know, those are still where we're seeing demand really outpace supply in a lot of places because of the extraordinary high rates of unemployment and how quickly the unemployment rate escalated. And so it's been very difficult to stay on top of those needs. We have seen in the last round of funding some of that evolution that we expected to see and where the needs are showing up. So still very much focused on basic needs, but you're hearing more concern in the community around issues related to child abuse and domestic violence because children aren't in places where that would be seen and reported to the authorities because they're not in school. You're hearing a lot of concern about the legal advocacy that people need to make sure that their rights are being upheld during this time. And we're also hearing increased needs around the limitations of how we're having to provide services right now. So for instance, the health clinics that have moved to telehealth, there's just some things you can't do via telehealth, right? So figuring out how to meet that need. And then finally, I would say there's an escalating concern, rightfully so, around mental health needs and mental health needs for everybody, for clients, for staff, for all of us, really, as a community as we go through this.
I really appreciate you mentioning mental health needs. I know, having been a part of this process, it's where we're going because we recognize that there is just this incredible amount of pressure on people during what has been an unprecedented time in the history of our country and our world, really. So let's shift a little bit, and we recognize that the pandemic has shown a light on numerous barriers to care. You've already kind of mentioned some of those, and resources and services that communities of color often face. And I think we would be remiss to not recognize, too, that we are in the midst of not only the pandemic, but also some really significant civil unrest. And so as we think of the reshaping of systems that cause these barriers in the work of leading on opportunity, can you describe how the barriers that the pandemic and really systemically what we're seeing across the board with our with the upheaval of systems occurring through the civil unrest are impacting economic mobility? So talk to us about those barriers and what impact you're seeing in relation to economic mobility.
Right. Well, I think, first, as you allude, the COVID pandemic and what we're seeing in the civil unrest, these are not unrelated things. The fact that Black and brown people are more impacted by COVID, both because of the illness, but also because they're more likely to be in economic distress as a result, more likely to have lost their jobs, or more likely to be in lower wage jobs where they're still expected to be on the front lines working and may not have, may be exposed to the virus. So, these are all things that are interrelated. And when you look at the rates of infection in the county, we see the same map that we see every time we talk about economic mobility. We see that the hardest hit areas are the zip codes in the crescent of Mecklenburg County. And in some ways, this is entirely predictable, right? When we know that we have disparate health outcomes and disparate economic and educational outcomes, then of course a pandemic is going to hit those populations harder. Of course it is. And so I think the COVID fund, in response to that, has tried very intentionally to make sure that we're funding organizations and groups and reaching out into neighborhoods that our institutional partners may not always do a good job of. And, I include United Way in that analysis, that sometimes our institutional partners, where they have great power and expertise at reaching a lot of people quickly and can deploy resources fast, they sometimes are not the best at reaching the small pockets of groups that maybe are not trusting of those institutions for good reason, or maybe they haven't had a presence in those neighborhoods. Maybe they aren't led by leaders of color, and so they're not trusted for that reason. And so from a funding perspective and on a micro level, we've tried to fund a mix of both institutional and grassroots partners to really get at that. And I will say, and I think the foundation would agree with this, I think that represents a change for us as a funding community in Charlotte. I mean, United Way has had Unite Charlotte for a number of years that we have funded. But when I think about other community-wide responses that we've had, I don't know that I've seen this kind of mix and real intentionality around that piece. And so I think that's a good thing. And certainly we can do more on that front, but I think it's a good thing. As far as the systems work, I mean, one perfect example is the need we're seeing around food. I mean, the escalation of need for food was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And that's because we have food deserts all over town. I mean, that's a direct result of having whole zip codes where people don't have grocery stores. So that's already a huge burden on families, a huge barrier to success. And then you add on a pandemic to it, and people are losing jobs and food becomes more scarce. And so, yeah, you saw food suddenly become the number one issue. Again, in some ways, really predictably, but we didn't anticipate it. We weren't being aggressive enough to address it. So I think, again, through COVID, we've seen, these examples of how the system is broken in so many ways, and we're able to sort of patch it together right now, right? We can put some money out there to fund food banks and food pantries and try to hold it together, but that's not addressing the underlying systemic problem. And that's really what we've got to get to.
Absolutely, Laura, you've given us a great deal to think about. And as we conclude the conversation, I'd like to ask if you have any final thoughts for the viewers around the work of the United Way, resources for assistance, anything that you'd like to mention in this last bit here.
Sure. So one thing, I mean, anytime anybody needs help in our community, they can always call 211. It's a United Way supported system that's throughout the country, but they do their best to try to match individuals with resources. From a broader perspective, I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from this epidemic and from our pandemic and from the civil unrest, and I think those lessons are intertwined. The silver lining in it is that we have some momentum around these issues that I've not seen in Charlotte before. It feels different. And I think a lot of us are feeling it feels different. We can't really name it, but it feels different. If we don't harness this now and really try to dig deep and say, all right, how are we going to address these systemic barriers this time? Then I think we're going to miss a golden opportunity. I'm proud of the programs that United Way funds. I think we fund a lot of great programs. We will never program our way out of this, though. We've got to really get to the root cause. so many of our programs are addressing the symptoms of what the real issues are. And I think COVID has really shown a light on that in a way that maybe we hadn't thought about in a while. So I'm optimistic that we're going to take this opportunity and turn it to our advantage as a community and really make some of the changes that we've known we need to.
I really appreciate you and the way you put that together. I think we're at this point where we are at a tipping point. And I share with you this hope that we will walk away from this better than how we started. So we appreciate your insight. We invite our viewers to share their thoughts in the comment section of this broadcast or submit questions to info@leadingonopportunity.org. You can also download the Leading on Opportunity Task Force report from our website, leadingonopportunity.org. Laura, thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Federico.